Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we are going to be making a Horus Heresy tier list. We are going to be talking about why tier lists are useful. We're going to be doing a tier list featuring all 18 Space Marine legions, and then we're also going to summarise what we've learned and what we can take away from creating that list. But before we do that, if you enjoy the content, please do leave me a like and subscribe just down there on YouTube, and if you've got any comments at all or feedback, please drop them to me too. And now, on with the show. Let's talk briefly about why create tier lists. Tier lists being traditionally associated with competitive games rather than games that are sort of semi-competitive narrative like Horus Heresy. Well, firstly, this video is for fun, and it's interesting as well, so keep that in mind. You know, I enjoy doing this. Lots of people enjoy watching and listening to these, and not everybody shares the same opinion, but it's interesting to see what lots of different people think. Tier lists are subjective, based on the parameters that you play within. Like, if you play in a much more sort of serious group of Horus Heresy players, the tier lists are going to shift, but the legions that are maybe a little bit better. And if you play in a much more narrative and casual environment, it's not going to matter at all in some ways, so in a lot of ways actually. But if you were to do a tier list in that environment, it'd likely be that everything would be a little bit more imbalanced because people will police themselves more. And, you know, doing a tier list basically doesn't mean that you have to go out and play the best legion on the list. And it doesn't mean that anybody else will either. The fact that this exists and the fact that other people do these doesn't mean everybody's suddenly going to buy the one at the top. So that's not something you need to worry about. And equally, if your legion does end up lower down on the list, it doesn't mean you can't play well and win games at all. You know, the distance between the tiers in Horus Heresy, everyone's a Space Marine, everyone's got access to the same basic stuff, means that the balance is pretty decent. It doesn't mean your legion is bad or a legion someone else is playing is bad because it's lower down. What this video contains ultimately is information. If you're playing one of the legions that are better, you might want to think about curbing the power of your legion because it's got so many natural advantages. You might want to make sure that you tone it down a little bit. And if you're playing a lower down legion on the list, you might want to give yourself a little bit of a leg up. You know, you might want to look at your list and say, okay, I can afford to make this list a bit better and put some more units in it that are good because I've got less natural advantages than another legion might have. So, you know, you can use this information plus your own knowledge, your own judgment, your knowledge of your own play group to make your games more fun ultimately and try to balance them out. So just setting the scene a little bit, the parameters, which I think about when I'm creating a list like this. So firstly, I'm not counting PDF units at all. I still don't consider them valid. I think they are poorly written, untested, not balanced well against each other. So I'm not counting PDF units at all, although I will mention them a couple of times. We are making some assumptions for this that you're not just playing missions where you do nothing but kill each other, like a lot of the book missions, and you're playing at least a reasonable number of games where objectives matter. So whether that's because you're playing some of the more objective-focused book missions, which are just better, frankly, or you're playing some custom scenarios, or you're playing in some events where the TOs have made some better events, we're going to assume that you are at least playing a sort of objective-based game rather than just shooting each other off the table. The last tier list I did do was quite broad, but in this one I'm going to try and separate the factions a bit more granularly so that, you know, you can see maybe where there are slight differences. But important to say that everything is very close. The difference between tiers, and we'll see this as we go on, in my opinion, really isn't that big. So, you know, something that's one tier above something else, I don't think there's much difference in it. These are going to be based on the potential of the army, basically. If you do the best things in the army without going over the top. So some armies, for example, Invictus Suzerains and Ultramarines, do have units that are broken, or even Wordbearers, Galvorbach units that are very, very good. And if you just spam lots of the same unit, some factions that do have access to that would be pushed up to the top. We're going to assume you're not doing that. So the tier list is based on you making good, solid, strong, powerful armies that also aren't spammy at the same time. And, you know, if you've watched much of my content, you'll know the kind of angle and power level that I go for. And this tier list is based on playing within that sort of level of little bit of self-policing against spam. And quite a few of these factions as you're going through, if you want to know more about them or you want to understand more about why I've ranked them the way I've done, there are some videos on the channel for most of these factions by now, so please do go and have a look at those as well. Alright, on with the tier list. So we're going to start with the Dark Angels. The Dark Angels have got two of the most powerful armory options in the game, the Tyrannic Greatsword and the Plasma Burner, as well as two of the best units in the game, Knight Cenobium and Interemptors as well, and that just makes them incredibly powerful, despite the fact that they've got some weaknesses in their Rites of War and in their Legion trait to some extent, although the Legion trait stacking with the Great Swords, making them +1 to hit, is absolutely amazing as well. They're quite simply the best faction in the game right now. Their units are the most powerful. They've got no particular drawbacks. They're just very, very good. Even if you don't spam those units, if you just use them, maybe some Companion Knights as well, they're just very, very powerful. And if you want to go the route of not spamming those units, but just using one of each of your elites, you've still got more good elites on the table than most other factions can even play. So Dark Angels, quite simply for me, best faction in the game right now, and it isn't even really that close. Emperor's Children next. So Emperor's Children do have a great trait when going up against other melee legions, or at least powerful melee units, but it is only on the charge. Emperor's Children suffer a little bit by having just worse versions of what some other factions have. So their weapons are just worse versions of some of the good weapons that other people have got. Their traits are defensive in nature, which is fine, but if you're not playing against another melee army, the effect of -1 to hit in combat or the Phoenix stance styles isn't actually that much. And, their advanced reaction is just, again, worse version of the advanced reactions other factions get. And for that reason, although I think Emperor's Children are decent and do have a good matchup into other melee legions, I think generally it just puts them a bit below average because of the weaknesses inherent there. Iron Warriors next. I think Iron Warriors are pretty balanced. They focus on shooting. They're good at it. Everything they do plays into the same theme. They've got bonuses against vehicles and dreadnoughts particularly, which is an important thing to have right now. They're really good. They don't do anything that's overpowered or silly. They've got super amounts of missiles that come out of Siege Tyrants, but they're only AP3. I think Iron Warriors are in a really good place, really effective, and a well-balanced army. White Scars. So White Scars do get some interesting stuff. They get Golden Keshig, which is really interesting. They get the Karash rule, which can be very broken depending on the scenarios you're playing, so we'll assume that you're playing missions where that doesn't completely break the game and you just win before you deploy any models. But Ebon Keshig are pretty good for what you get. Their unique glaive that they get is pretty good, their faction glaive. Their trait lets them down a bit, like +1 move. You can't underestimate how good that can be in some circumstances, but a lot of the time, +1 doesn't change enough. And, winning the Siege Initiative role again can be very powerful situationally, but sometimes, depending on what you're doing, isn't always a thing you want to be doing. So, whilst they have definitely some good tools in their box, and I think every other legion should be jealous of the sheer power of Golden Keshig, being able to basically delete anything they want off the board whenever. Also, they do get a good unique Javelin with toughness 7 and lots of random weapons, that's good. I just think that overall, because of the weaknesses they've got in their Legion trait, that it just brings them down a little bit, and I think they're just a little bit below average. Space Wolves. Space Wolves, much like Iron Warriors, have got a pretty singular focus. It's on melee. They've got lots of buffs to melee, they've got good melee weapons, they've got good melee units. Their unique units are pretty decent. Importantly, they get bonuses to getting there, which is normally the thing that melee armies need to be most effective, is getting across the table more quickly. And for the units they don't affect, with that rule, the +1 weapon skill is also very powerful. So I think Space Wolves do what they do and do it well. You've just got to get them there in the first place, which is obviously something you build your army around, and they've got the tools to do that. Imperial Fists. Now, Imperial Fists, people are quite up in arms over the power level of Imperial Fists. They obviously have a lot of very strong things, but they can't quite do them all at once, because the Rites of War that make Phalanx Warders strong, stop you from using your Deep Strike Terminators, for example. So you can't quite do all of their things all at once. And although their Legion bonus is good when you pair it with Assault Cannons, there's an awful lot of things in your army that it won't affect. And some builds of your army, if you go with lots and lots of Phalanx Warders, you're not going to get as much use out of that +1 to hit with those auto weapons as well. So, whilst I do think Imperial Fists are very good, I don't think they get to quite leverage all their options at once in any given army. And also the things that they do that are very powerful, some of them are only powerful when you're really spamming, which we are going to assume people aren't doing for this tier list. And some of the things they do that are powerful, like Phalanx Warders, can actually be dealt with if your army is set up to deal with things like that. A good amount of Volkite Culverins, or even just Bolter Fire in good volumes, can take those things down. It's only when you're packing lots of Last Cannons and stuff that they're good against that they become a problem. So experienced players building decent armies can actually handle Imperial Fists much better than, people who are a bit less experienced. So I do think Imperial Fists are definitely above average, very powerful. Above average, but not very powerful. I don't think they come quite up to Dark Angels on the sort of, overpoweredness scales. Night Lords. Night Lords have got a really fantastic Legion trait. It's good against everything in the game that is good. It can easily buff every unit in your army, and they've also got this really powerful sub-theme around night fighting. Now, they do get pigeonholed a little bit into the Terror Assault Rite of War, unfortunately, to really make the use of that leadership debuff and to enable them to get closer without taking as much damage and that kind of stuff. So I do think they are a balanced force, ultimately, but if you're not going to use Terror Assault, I do think they maybe drop a little bit because all their stuff just synergizes so well with it. It's almost like you've got to play it every game, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing because it is very Night Lords. On the other hand, I think that Night Lords could easily be above average just because of the synergy they've got, but there are lots of things in the game like Dreadnoughts and Vehicles where their ability to pin you and reduce your leadership doesn't do anything, and there are ways to mitigate their night fighting with things like Augury Scanners or some Legions that can get night fighting immunity as well. So I think on balance of things, in a lot of games they'll have a big advantage, but in some games they won't be able to use their advantage, and I think that's what keeps them in the balanced tier. Blood Angels, very good. Much like Space Wolves, they are good in melee, and they've got the ways to get there as well. They also have a really good and powerful unit in Dawnbreakers, but also Angels tiers with assault cannons as well, and they've got access to those assault cannons which are powerful, just like Imperial Fists. So I think Blood Angels are really good at what they do. They've got all the right synergies in there, let down a little bit by their armory to some extent and their right to war, but they are very powerful. They do their thing well. I need to stop saying very powerful when that's the name of one of the tiers, but they are good, and they do their thing well, and I think they come out quite well balanced. Likewise, Iron Hands as well, on the flip side, are very good at shooting and making use of their defensive bonus. I think they've got the best Legion trait in the game, probably, although against some armies, there are quite a lot of melee-focused armies, and although I always advise bringing guns, even with those armies, a lot of people don't, so sometimes the trait won't do as much, but if you play into the trait, they are obviously very strong with Dreadnoughts and Infantry that are quite harder to kill. Where they lose out is they got very little stuff in the book, so they haven't really got any amazing unique units. Medusan Immortals are only good in one of their Rites of War, which stops you taking Ferrous Manus. It's quite restrictive. They didn't do that well out of their armory as a whole, although they did get Grav Shredders, which are quite powerful. So the stuff they have got is quite good, but you are forced to use that stuff and only that stuff if you want them to be good. And if you don't use that stuff or lean into it, they definitely drop in, power level if you decide to use more vehicles, less infantry and dreadnoughts. World Eaters, similar vein again to Space Wolves. They do what they do. They do it well. They've got the right bonuses. They've got good stuff for getting there in Berserker Assault, Kharn turning off reactions. They've got the best selection of melee weapons in the game. I think outside of the two other individually good melee weapons, they got lots of great weapons in there, which makes their powerful units more powerful because they've got the right weapons. And I think they're in a really good place. I think they're balanced. They get there, they're going to give you a hard time. You've just got to stop them getting there, and their job is to get to you. Ultramarines. Ultramarines are an interesting one. So they, like Iron Hands or Salamanders, didn't get an awful lot, but what they've got is very solid in raw numbers terms. Their Legion trait is fantastic. Their advanced reaction is fantastic. Their armory is very powerful, if uninspiring. AP2 weaponry at initiative, even though it's only strength users, very good. What really pushes them up is Invictus Suzerains. Much like Knight Cenobium, this unit is completely broken. If you take one of them in your army, even just one of them in your army, you're going to be at a big advantage to anyone else you play. But if you do choose to spam that unit, Ultramarines can easily be the best army in the game or compete with Dark Angels. If you use PDFs, which although I'm not considering for this, Ultramarines got really silly stuff in the PDFs, and if you do use PDFs, I think Ultramarines will be the best army in the game because of Fulminataris Terminators and also the Lokiataris Storm Squads as well. But as it is, I think they're above average, verging on very powerful if you really want to push using multiple of those Suzerain squads. Death Guard next. I think the Death Guard faction trait is fun and quite unique, but ultimately for me, there's not any great ways to leverage the Death Guard faction trait into something super powerful. You know, it's nice to be able to move heavy support units around and still fire them, but does that really put you in a game-winning position? It makes multi-melters a bit better. That's cool, but I don't think it really does an awful lot for the faction. And likewise, you know, their armory and their unique units, while very flavorful and doing the stuff you want Death Guard to do thematically, they don't have any AP2, they don't have any combat monster units, they haven't got any of the things that are like really powerful to really lift the army up to the level of other armies. And I think, you know, depending on where you fall on the Legion trait, you may think it lets you drive your vehicles at full whack and still fire your weapons, which maybe it does, but that's not really a very Death Guard-y thing. You know, we want the infantry to be moving around. So regardless of where you fall on that, I think Death Guard are just a little bit weak. Their toolbox just isn't very powerful in particular. Now, that's not to say they aren't good and can't easily play against other armies and win games. They clearly can. I just think they've got less good stuff in their kit. Thousand Suns next. So, Thousand Suns Legion trait and their cults give them access to so many options and so many ways to set your army up to take advantage of improved invulnerable saves, you know, moving up the board faster, sniping out people's special units, all that kind of stuff, and lots of access to librarians for cheap, which is very powerful. The problem is all of these things rely on you making lots of psychic rolls, and it's sort of the only Legion trait, if you like, that is like locked behind you rolling stuff every turn, and there's obviously a downside in perils when you do fail them. When you're taking so many across the board every turn, you are going to fail some. And that's quite a disadvantage. Also, being able to turn their Legion trait off in a way by just killing the characters with snipers, so the psychers in the unit aren't there anymore, is also quite a big downside. So they do get some great stuff. The Terminators and the Osiron Dreadnought are good. Kinnerai have got incredible combat potential, although only AP3. So that stuff's really good, but, you know, the way their traits work and the amount of rules that you've got to roll for them just pulls them down a little bit, and those units are expensive as well. So I think Thousand Suns come in, for me, just a little bit below average. Sons of Horus. Now, originally my thoughts on the Sons of Horus trait were that it was very powerful. You know, it makes you pseudo-immune to most instant death weapons in the game, certainly in the first round of combat, so Thunderhammers aren't going to instant death your Terminators, which is a really powerful thing to have access to. The problem with it is for most of the game, a lot of the time, it's actually going to be doing nothing. Against shooty armies, you kind of don't care because they're not bringing a lot of those weapons. Against melee armies, it is powerful, but sometimes you're not fighting things where that is super relevant. -1 to be wounded is always good in combat in melee. It's just that when you actually see this on the table, and I've played against Sons of Horus quite a few times and seen them played a lot, it actually doesn't equate to a great plan for winning the game. Also, their armory, their advanced reaction, all that kind of stuff is a little bit on the mediocre side as well. And a lot of Sons of Horus players that I know are struggling with, you know, how do you make a good Sons of Horus army? How do you really leverage what they've got to make it great? You know, Just Air and even are quite expensive for what they do compared to what other legions have got. Now, for that reason, I think Sons of Horus actually are a little bit below the curve. I think they're a little bit below average for me, and I think that's the right place for them. Wordbearers are a bit of a dichotomy, so they got some really good stuff like Galvorbach, but they don't really have a good enough melee weapon to leverage how good they are. They've got lots of good elite units though. Marigal, Dreadnought, Ashen Circle are all really good, but they're all quite balanced good. You know, they've got upsides and downsides, but they're all in the elite slot, so it's really hard to leverage the advantage of having a bunch of good units when they're all competing for the same slots. Also, they've got a really bad Legion trait. It's not as, you know, it's not useless, but it's certainly on the weaker end. It's probably the worst in the game, competing with Death Guard. And also, as well, their armory, whilst okay in some respects, you know, their unique weapons are just far too expensive, the tainted weapons. The unique plasma is good, but very, very pricey as well. It's quite, and corrupted, the costs for putting corrupted on your army can add up really quickly as well. So, whilst they're super interesting, and this may well change when Demons of the Ruinstorm come out, I think right now, Wordbearers are a little bit below average. Now, if you wanted to spam Galvorbach, this would definitely go up. You know, if you want to put multiple of that unit in your army, although I think, you know, spamming those things doesn't leave you with a super interesting army for me. Salamanders. Now, I originally was a little bit down on Salamanders as being, in the bottom tier, but they've come up a little bit for me after thinking about it and thinking about what they can potentially achieve. Their flamers are great for free. +1 strength and those extra shots in Overwatch is really powerful for free, especially when you can make those units align in one of your Rites of War. They do get a really good Psyker in the other Rite of War as well, which is quite good. And obviously Fire Drakes and Pyroclasts with their dual node firing are both great units as well. So I think whilst if you were playing book missions where just, focusing on killing each other is the thing, I think Salamanders have got plenty of bad matchups when you play against an army that can keep you at range. But if you're playing again in more objective-focused games, better missions, maybe using some custom missions or playing narrative objective missions, they really go up in value because people have got to come to you and fight you at close range where you can really leverage those flamers. Their Legion trait also, whilst often a little bit on the weak side, can sometimes be on the strong side. When people bring a lot of Melter and Plasma, which some people do, it can be really powerful, so it's quite swingy. I do think ultimately they are a little bit below average still, but they've gone up in my estimation since I first looked at tier lists. Raven Guard don't get a lot, but what they do get is very good. Raven's Talons are an incredible weapon, and they are really good versus Dreadnoughts, which are generally the scariest thing in the game for a lot of people, but really anything that's tough for a toughness value, like Armigers that are coming out, they're great at killing. They're great at killing Marines because they got Shred and AP3. They're great at killing Terminators, again, because they've got that Rend. They're just good at killing everything, and Dark Furies make really good use of them as a good unit. Also, the ability to infiltrate large amounts of your army, even though not as much as you maybe could last edition, is just a really powerful thing, and it puts you again in game-winning positions, whereas having great raw numbers like Imperial Fists is a good thing for your army. Things that allow you to position correctly on the board tend to be game winners. And for that reason, I think that Raven Guard are in above average. Even though they haven't got tons of stuff, what they have got is very, very good. And lastly, Alpha Legion. It's hard not to rate Alpha Legion in one of the higher categories when some things in the higher categories are there on the strength of their units, and Alpha Legion can steal them. So Alpha Legion can use those Invictus Suzerains or Dark Furies that push some of these legions up into the above average category, and therefore they've got to be above average by default as well. But they've got a very good Legion trait. They've got a very good advanced reaction as well. That can be, quite game changing. They've got access to great builds via Armorless Dynat and also Alfarius as well, giving things infiltrate for the same reason as the Raven Guard. And I just think that the options Alpha Legion have got for winning games are just very good, and for that reason I think they go in above average as well. And so there's the tier list. That's where I think things stand today when we separate them a little bit granularly. Now, interestingly, if you look at this, and probably not a surprise to a lot of people, certainly wasn't a surprise to me, if you were to assign these points values to each one of these tiers, a little weak being 1, very powerful being 5, and, put traitors against loyalists, loyalists get 30 points out of this, and traitors only get 22. That's quite a big difference in the average power level of loyalists versus traitor legions. And also as well, loyalists have got 2 legions below balanced. Traitors have got 5. Right? That's a lot. And loyalists have got 4 legions above balanced, where traitors have only got 1. It's really a very stark difference in where these things sit. And, you might move some of these up and down yourself. You might not agree with all of them. But I think it's fairly clear to see that loyalists are really coming out on top at the moment in the sort of battle of the loyalists and traitors. So in summary, the difference between the tiers, as you can see from the list, even moving between 2 tiers, really is not actually that huge. You could comfortably argue that many of the legions could go up or down a tier, and really for me that shows that the balance of the legions is generally quite good. The most overpowered legions are generally in that place just because of a couple of broken units. And as I said at the very start of the show, if you want to spam those units, then yes, you can make some of those legions, insanely powerful compared to others. But if you do self-police yourself reasonably well, you don't spam the things that are the best, the gulf between different legions is not really that big. And that's, a pretty good place for the game to be in, and I still stand by that being a good thing. And that's the end of the show. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've gotten some interesting information out of it that you can use in your games of Horus Heresy. If you did enjoy the content, please do leave me a like and subscribe. And if you've got any comments at all, please leave them in the YouTube comments down below. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.